Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Mellon Foundation, and I am loving watching all of you saying hello in the chat from so many different places. Keep it coming. We're so honored that you decided to join this conversation and be part of it today. And thank you for your patience with us getting started. We want to know who you are, where you're watching from, and if you have questions for our speakers today. We are always really excited. We found that as we do more and more of these programs, the richness of what happens in the chat is a part of the conversation. It's all of a piece. So today I am very honored and excited to convene this conversation about mass incarceration in the United States, the toll it takes on us all, and the liberatory power of the arts and humanities to counter the isolation and inhumanity of the interconnected and discriminatory structures of prisons, jails, immigrant detention centers, policing, prosecution, and probation. Last week at the Mellon Foundation, we publicly launched a $125 million initiative called Imagining Freedom, which aims to make visible and audible the experiences of people impacted by the criminal legal system. More than 70 million people in the United States have been arrested, prosecuted, or convicted of a crime. Nearly half of all Americans have a relative who has been incarcerated. And nearly 1 in 5 children in the United States has a currently or formerly incarcerated parent. Which is to say that whether we realize it or not, the criminal legal system impacts all of us, the collective we. Through this initiative, we're aiming to support those who are system impacted in their artistic practice and humanistic learning, thinking, and knowledge building and sharing, and to strengthen and expand broader creative and intellectual communities. As we move forward in this conversation today, which is a part of and a big public moment in our launching Imagining Freedom, and we can think of no better way to do it, I would like to acknowledge those who are currently incarcerated, who may not be with us physically or virtually, but who are nevertheless alongside us. And not right now, but we're working on a way to make this available to others. Joining us today to discuss how the arts and humanities drive opportunities for civic, scholarly, and creative engagement across the criminal legal system are our 4 extraordinary guest speakers. Dr. Gina Dent, Dr. Angela Davis, Mitchell S. Jackson, and Jesse Krimes. I am so excited. Oh, there you are. I am so happy to see all of you and so excited that we are here together today. And so let me tell our audience a little bit about each of you. Dr. Gina Dent is a renowned scholar and expert in Africana literary and cultural studies, legal theory, and popular culture. The author of numerous publications, including the forthcoming book, Prison is a Border. She is an award-winning associate professor of feminist studies, history of consciousness, and legal studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Angela Davis is a globally celebrated activist, scholar, and philosopher. She is the author of many groundbreaking texts and a distinguished professor emerita in the history of consciousness and feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Through her words and deeds, she has become a global icon for freedom and justice and rights. Mitchell S. Jackson is a professor and writer whose publications include fiction, memoir, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Runner's World article, 12 Minutes and a Life, an extraordinary account of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and so much more. That doesn't even really begin to describe all that is in that amazing essay. A former Guggenheim Fellow and recipient of the PEN/Hemingway Debut Fiction Award, he currently teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. And Jesse Krimes is an artist, curator, and co-founder of Right of Return USA, the first national fellowship dedicated to supporting formerly incarcerated artists. His work as a visual artist has been celebrated in museum spaces ranging from MoMA PS1 to the Palais de Tokyo, and cited in various media outlets, including NPR and the Wall Street Journal. And we'll have a chance to see some of it today. Gina, Angela, Mitchell, and Jesse, my heart is bursting out of the screen. We welcome you and we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, of course. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you in turn to tell us about your primary life space, your primary place of life, and how and where mass incarceration exists or does not exist in that space. What kind of knowledge and awareness do members of your community where you live have about mass incarceration? And anyone who would like to start. Gina, why don't I start with you?
All right. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm so thrilled about this initiative, and I am speaking from unceded Ohlone territory. I'm in Oakland, California. I live here in a place that actually has been a center for abolitionist organizing for a long time. I'm in the place that developed critical resistance, in the place that had the Prison Activist Resource Center, the Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, the Ella Baker Center, Creative Interventions, many organizations that have been built over time to try and address the needs of those who are currently incarcerated and to enable others to exchange with us in ways in the free world. So in our community, the issues of mass incarceration are well known. We have recently had a successful campaign by the Black Organizing Project to remove police from schools, which was a really, really important first move. We also have a very robust restorative justice environment here. And so the Bay Area has been an incubator of many of the contemporary thinking around incarceration. On the other hand, it's also a space where there is now the representation of people who are fighting to change our criminal legal system in office. And there's also a lot of public concern around this and agitation. And so it will be interesting to see how we move through this next period. And I think the work of creatives and artists is going to be absolutely essential to allow us to do that.
Thank you. Mitchell.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I live and teach in Phoenix, so Arizona, which has for years, been a kind of test case for for-profit prisons, and I was just reading up on an article, actually it was published last year, where the head of the DOC told legislators that the several communities in Arizona would collapse. That was his word, in quotes, collapse, if they didn't have the prison system there. So that, I think that is really telling of how prisons operate in that space. I will also say I'm from Portland, Oregon, very proud Portland, Oregon native. And so when you talk about home and space, it's really Portland that I'm thinking of. And I was both heartened and maybe disheartened last election when we voted out language that from the Constitution that criminalized or that allowed slavery for people who had been convicted of a crime. And then I looked at the exit polls, and 45% of Oregonians voted to keep it in. So that also was very telling to me of the kind of holistic view of my state and the place that I call home. So both of those two things tell me that there's a lot of work to be done in the places that I reside and that are dear to me.
Thank you. Angela.
Well, I also live in Oakland, California, and I feel privileged to be able to have been able to witness the growing collective awareness of the central role that imprisonment plays in producing and reproducing structural racism. I think I want to emphasize the fact that Oakland, California is where the Black Panther Party was founded. And if one looks at the number 8 on the Black Panther Party's 10-point program from way back in 1966, that point emphasizes the importance of looking at prison and places of incarceration. It says, we want freedom for all Black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. And also, perhaps I should say that I spent approximately 2 years, first of all, making myself unavailable to the FBI, which is how we describe my period of being underground during my trial. And I spent time making myself unavailable to the FBI. And I spent almost 2 years in 3 different jails and on trial. And then I was on trial for 3 charges, all of which carried the death penalty. And since I'm talking about his historical space, I should say that I feel very fortunate to have been able to participate in the organization National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which fought for the freedom of political prisoners, and Critical Resistance, which is a movement that Gina and I worked with since the late 90s, which has been central to the development of a collective awareness of the damages produced by incarceration and the development of an abolitionist perspective that urges us to imagine new ways of addressing the problems that prisons presume to, but can never effectively address.
Thank you. Jesse.
Yeah, so I'm currently based in Philadelphia, which may still be the most incarcerated city in the country. If not, it's probably number 2. And so, I'm based here. My studio is here. And I think that, obviously, Larry Krasner is here. There is a lot of work that I think is being done in this community specifically to lower the incarceration rates. I think the racial disparities in the city are also some of the highest in the country when it comes to incarceration. But I also split my time between here and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. And it's very much like a rural part of PA. So we often kind of joke about like Pennsylvania being like Pennsyltucky, right? And so I'm very kind of cognizant of transitioning back and forth between these worlds, because like you were talking about those numbers earlier of like 1 out of every 2 people has an immediate family member who's been incarcerated, right? That's true in Lancaster. But it's really interesting to me because the conversations that are being had in Philadelphia are not necessarily the same conversations that are being had in Lancaster. In fact, they're not really being had that much at all. And so, when I think about like place and kind of like the spaces that I occupy, both like where I'm from, which is also like home of the Amish and Mennonites, which have a very strong restorative justice practice. But again, it's like those things aren't kind of translating into the real world, at least in that location as they exist today for the broader community. So I think about myself as a visual artist and like how I occupy space and how to create work and basically like bridge the kind of movement and advocacy space with the art world and use that as like a tool to kind of bring community together. So that's kind of like how I think about space.
Thank you all. Thank you. Angela, I wanted to talk with you about the language and the terms that are used to discuss the urgent justice issues of policing, prisons, the legal systems have developed over time. I think about perhaps 25 years ago when you were talking about mass incarceration, prison industrial complex, the carceral state, that human caging. That this language, these phrases that are so useful to so many people now, were not always so. So I would love you to talk about language and moving useful language into wider usage, and how you think about the importance of having clear language that exactly states what we're talking about.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And of course, language is always central to our efforts to engage in projects of radical social transformation. And I think of mass incarceration as a term that was popularized by Michelle Alexander, by the way. And that term helped to introduce new ways of thinking about the role of the police and prisons and in maintaining structural racism. But of course, a critical take on new vocabularies would also require that we recognize that a term like mass incarceration can also lead people to assume that we need smaller scales of incarceration, which can lead to the idea that only people who deserve to be in prison should be there. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, early on, and I want to talk just a bit about the experience of critical resistance, which is a collective experience. We recognize, all of us were abolitionists, but we recognize that abolitionist ideas would only resonate among a relatively small number of people. So a group of us decided that we should nevertheless work on changing the way people think about incarceration by introducing new vocabularies. And as a matter of fact, that was a workshop at the founding conference, a workshop on new vocabularies. And we decided that the term prison industrial complex, which had already been used by Gina, help me.
Mike Davis.
Mike Davis, which had been introduced by Mike Davis in an article he wrote about the transformation of California economy from an agricultural economy to a prison-based economy. So we decided to take on that term because it would allow us, in the first place, to disarticulate crime and punishment, to argue that people don't necessarily go to prison because they have committed crimes, even when they have committed those crimes. That's not why they're in prison. They're in prison because of racism, because of class bias, because of heteropatriarchy, because of capitalism. And the prison industrial complex, this term would encourage people to think about the way in which global capitalism has produced rising numbers of imprisoned people, deindustrialization, the dismantling of the welfare state, and the use of the prison as a dumping ground for those who were rendered superfluous. And of course, Ruthie Gilmore talks about surplus populations. And this produces also the acceptability of imprisonment on the most superficial grounds. It was a central aspect of the work we attempted to do. Later, we began to talk about abolition feminism in order to intervene into the anti-violence movement. And dominant sectors of that movement were calling for more punishment for those who were agents of gender violence. So language is absolutely central. It can help to shift our consciousness, and during the present era, of course, we're attempting to talk about abolition in a way that will urge people to imagine different ways of addressing the problems that the prison presumes to but can never effectively address. So new vocabularies are so central, and I thank you so much for assisting in this process of shifting the way in which people think about carcerality in our society.
Well, I think that for, all of us in this conversation today, the great wide space here and ahead is the space of creativity, of imagination, of sharing humanity in that particular way, of developing new modes of critical thinking that come out of having to solve these problems from a different perspective than the outside, and so forth. So for you, Gina, I wanted to know about your journey as a scholar of African American literature and culture, and the evolution to the work that you're doing now. It's been an interesting road.
Yes, I mean, I suppose it's an evolution. I guess evolution is the right word because it feels to me entirely consistent with the way that I learned to think about Black literature. I learned about Black literature in a global context, not only in English, and that meant thinking about questions of borders, slavery, conquest, and of difference of various kinds. And so I was always dealing with fields of force and questions of power. And the cultural studies environment in which I came up allowed that. And in fact, I studied law and anthropology along with literature in order to enable myself to address some of the issues raised in those literatures more directly. And so it became really obvious to me as I started to get working with prison issues more as an activist, that actually we needed to pay attention to these issues as scholars. And I actually tried to do that. In fact, at Critical Resistance, I think one of the panels that I chaired was on visual culture in the prison, I believe, or something, visual culture in something. And so, this was something that happened back in 1998. But the truth was that I never thought it would be part of my research life, because as a humanist, it was understood that I would have nothing to contribute from that vantage point that would advance the thinking around incarceration. Of course, that really tells you how much has shifted, that we now, I think, fully understand that we need all of the various kinds of scholarship together, and not only scholarship, but activism and community building that will allow us to think about these issues in deeper ways. And in fact, the intractable issue of the criminal legal system can only really be addressed through the full disciplinary matrix that touches on all of the issues that the prison industrial complex presents for us. So I actually feel like it's entirely consistent in the work that I was trained to do, but it was work that was invisibilized in the university and in the larger context. And I'm thrilled to have been able to work with so many organizations over the years, but I'm maybe shocked that I'm living during the time when this is actually part of a broader public conversation and a conversation that can happen in a university context. And so I'm actually especially thrilled to say that my campus has just established a Visualizing Abolition Studies curriculum. And we are going to be training students through the arts and humanities to think carefully about how we receive the data on incarceration, how we are inundated by an environment that tells us about incarceration every day in ways that we are not interrogating. And so I feel that it's a natural evolution for me. And it's so important to address the global issues that I learned about maybe first from reading that literature.
Thank you. Mitchell, I'd like to hear just about, it's a big question that's too big. So you can answer it as concisely as you can. And the question is you and language and words and writing. Just tell us the story of how that came to be the thing you knew you had both to give, but also for yourself.
Yeah, I don't even want to say love of writing. My introduction to writing or aspiring to be a writer happened when I was incarcerated in an Oregon prison. I came home. I say it's an introduction because I didn't really have a sense of what it meant to be a writer. That took many more years for me to have that experience, but I did come home with some pages. And one thing that I have always kind of prided myself on is having a really high value on craft and of learning what it meant to do the thing that I was going, or at least attempting to do. And so I ended up going to graduate school. And then that's where I kind of found out, what people were reading and the techniques that people were using. But I really have to give credit to mentorship. One of the people maybe I pushed him into mentorship was Gina Dent, who I hope is a person most of this group knows and has been really instrumental in my career, but also just an encouragement. So I would say that coming to writing was a kind of dream in the beginning, and it really took someone whom I respected and who had kind of already forged a pathway to bring me to a place where I felt confident enough to pursue it, because there's so much disappointment. There's so much time involved in trying to make something on the page. And so, yeah, I think that's really important. And I think also, coming out of prison, you wanted things, or at least I did. I wanted things fast. And it was the reason why I ended up in prison in the first place. And writing taught me a patience that I didn't have before. It taught me to examine my circumstances in a way I wasn't examining them before, especially writing nonfiction, right? That it really pointed me towards the history of my state and the racial covenants and the real estate covenants and the history of how Black people were moved from one section of the city to another. And so all of those things really came out of writing and mentorship and really having a kind of sustained vision for a way that I can impact people. Once I figured out that I might be able to impact people or add some value to someone's life, that really, really fueled, it does fuel me every day at the chair.
And think back, going back to John Edgar Wideman, did he mentor you from his pages, or did you have a relationship with him? How did that happen?
Yeah, in person. I studied with him over a summer at NYU, and I really pressed him. Like, I literally said, "Hey, I'm looking for a mentor, man," and he was like, "I'm kind of busy," and I put some more pressure on him. And he's been very encouraging. And one thing about John that I really appreciate is he always tells me the truth, and he's never impressed. Right? He'll never just, like, even when I sent him 12 minutes in a life, he was like, "That's nice, but did you think about this? Or did you think about that? Or did you think about approaching it like this? And I would have loved a little more of this." And so for me, you need someone who you respect, who's going to tell you the truth, and who you know is doing it in your best interest too. And so I'm really, really thankful to have him out here, not only still doing the work, but then also looking out for me in that way.
He's been a very important writer to me as well. And I think about all that, however long ago Brothers and Keepers came out, 35 years ago. and how he gave the voice to his brother Robbie, who was inside. And so that was their book together. Or in, all of the Homewood books, the way that he writes about neighborhood always had a sense of people in, people out, people back, people forth, people connected to each other. Not to mention those sentences. So I'm happy to think about and to hear you raise up his work. Jesse, let's just dive right into some of the images that we have of your work, but also would like asking the same question about how you came to making art. And we're going to get to look at some things.
Yeah, and I was going to say, pretty much since the age of 13, I've transitioned through like nearly every facet of our criminal justice system, right? From like juvenile probation and jail to state prison to federal prison. And I think the works that are we going to put them up on the screen?
Yeah, why don't we put them up? Yep.
So I think kind of transitioning through all of those systems. And again, that's kind of like over a long period of time that those, interactions were happening in these different spaces. But in between that, I was also able to go to college, and I had an amazing professor who really challenged me to think critically about the world, introduced me to Foucault's Discipline and Punish. And that radically altered how I basically understood kind of my story, and as an anecdotal, one-off, it's my failure. But after reading Foucault, I very quickly began to realize how this is a systematic problem, that this is something that is specifically being designed, right, for very intentional purposes. And so that my last prison sentence, I had literally just graduated from college 2 weeks prior to that, and then got indicted by the federal government. They caught me with a small amount of cocaine and ended up charging me with up to 50 kilos of drugs that never existed. And they also placed me from the one jail that I was in into another facility and put me in solitary confinement for a year. And so I bring up that story because it's I think having kind of read Foucault and then going immediately into the system again, with that kind of knowledge, which I didn't have prior, made me really think about how to use the materials of the prison against itself. And so for me, language is visual, right? Every material has a very kind of specific language, and how you partner that material with other materials can say very different things. And it was very interesting to me because it's most people are trained how to read and understand information, right? That's pretty much what the school process is about. But there's no real education that is based on visual language and understanding that. And kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, I actually think both visual language and the written word are equally powerful, right? They influence our decisions, our behaviors, what we see as beautiful or normal, or just all sorts of kind of societal norms that are based upon visual culture, right? And visual language. And so anyway, that's kind of the long way of saying when I was in prison, I was reading the paper, and there would be mugshots in the newspaper while I was in solitary confinement. And so I started to kind of remove those negative depictions of people from this one moment in their life and transfer them onto the surface of soap, which again, soap, prison issued soap, it has all of the kind of, it has that latent language of cleansing and purification and repentance, all of the things that the penitentiary supposedly is built to do. And so I transferred those images onto the soap, And then in the next slide, you'll see that I had to kind of smuggle these out of my cell. And so I started collecting used playing cards from other guys in the block who would play poker through the bars of their cell. And I would collect them and glue them together to create these containers to safely mail them out. And, so for me, it was like thinking of ways to communicate with the outside world through the visual language of the prison. And then the next slide, I eventually fought the drug charges at my sentencing and was found guilty of like 500 grams. And so I got a reduced sentence. So instead of the mandatory minimum of like 10 years to life that I was looking at, the judge gave me a 6-year federal prison sentence. But I went into the federal system and then had access to more materials. And so the piece that you're seeing on the screen is basically a recreation of an original work that I made when I was in Farrington Federal Correctional Center, where I was basically taking imagery out of the New York Times and transferring it onto the surface of prison bed sheets. And again, my thinking was like, people are reading the New York Times, but they're reading the textual language, right? But they're not reading the visual language. So what happens when I remove all of the text and just transfer every single image in every single issue of the New York Times over a period of 3 years onto these prison bed sheets? And it was interesting what was reflected back, right? It was like a very white, saturated world. And it was a world that is like mainly features women as commodities, right? As objects. And so there are all of these kind of things happening in the world, but then they're mixed with commercial advertisements. And again, these things all kind of form norms and value systems. And so that's kind of the works that I made when I was incarcerated.
And we have another slide, Jesse, of Apocalyptine, I think. Could we put up the second slide? I think we have another one. Yeah. So that gives a sense of it in its whole space. And as I understand it, so this is Eastern Penitentiary. Is it the oldest penitentiary in the country?
Yeah, so Eastern State Penitentiary is the first penitentiary in the country.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what you're seeing here, it's also a historic site now, and the director there is doing amazing projects, really engaging with people and through their programming. But this is a installation that I basically kind of framed out an entire cell, recreated the textures of the interior, and then pretty much glued a recreation of the original onto the walls. But because the original piece is 15 feet tall and 40 feet long, it took me 3 years to make and smuggle out of the prison. And so I didn't want to end up gluing that onto anything. So that one's safely in boxes in my studio.
Thank you. It's amazing. It's amazing. Mitchell, you were going to read an excerpt of your work for us.
That's right. But I also wanted to add in the vocabulary of returning citizen, which is not new. But I do think, when we think about mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex, it seems to me like we're looking down into a kind of a system. And I think the returning citizen is a way for a person who has been affected to kind of reimagine how they're looking out at the world too. When we think about what is citizenship. And I think that's really important. I'm sure maybe for Jesse and, for me, if I had that language, it probably would have given me a different vantage back in 1998. So I wanted to add that.
You held on to returning citizen. It was language that you held on to when you were inside as a way of thinking ahead.
No, I wish that I had it then. I wasn't even aware. You wish you
had it then.
Yeah, maybe a decade or so ago. And I think, out of that language, maybe we get to, the restoring of voting rights, in Florida a few years ago. Like, I really do think that language really does have power, but it's a part of the language that feels like an individual looking out at the world or redefining themselves in the world versus us trying to give a category for a kind of broad systemic problem. which both of them obviously are valuable, right? But I'm thinking like, how would I have seen the world if I thought that I was a returning citizen versus an ex-con or a parolee?
Yes, 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 yes.
I'm going to read just a minute or so from Survival Math, which is an essay collection about home. Let's see here. We also homage the rose garden, rose quarter, rose bushes in the yards of homes in the West Hills, in neighborhoods where developers build and open up to the public a new street of dreams every year. A street, that is, for someone else's dreams. Because the truth is, some of us dream, but far too many dream small, realistic. And when those young dreams desert us, some of us start demanding by force things that ain't ours. Others move to Vegas to pimp, purchase a new ride, and voyage home with the intent of triumphing down MLK. Those who stay local, those with aspirations average as shit, buy and abandon faith, covet restored muscle cars with custom systems, exotic paint, and wire rims with too many spokes to count. Others cop a sack from a big homie, a pre-cooked and acetone cut underweight dope sack, and stand on a street grown folk warned us off of. Corners where young boys whose quivering flames were doused previous to ours carry stolen straps and grudges against the world. We posted on a hot block all night for damn near nothing, only half of which, if we were lucky, was ours to keep. That was our cosmos, the reason there's been a hell of a chance of finding who we've been looking for in the Justice Center, if for weeks we ain't seen them on the streets.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Gina, I wanted to invoke a phrase that you've used, carceral visuality. And hear some more about that, and also use that to move into, I'm thinking about what Jesse was saying about visual thinking, visual language, and thinking about the ways that language can empower and language can degrade. And what we also know is that for people who have certain learning challenges, for people who are disserved by the school system, by children who are disserved by society, sometimes words and writing and language can feel very far away. And I wonder if there's a way that it's harder to get to visual intelligence. That if there were ways that we could nourish people's visual intelligence, that maybe that's not quite as, tamped down and used against us in the way that language is. So that was a riff, but I would love to know what about that, your use of that phrase, and also about the Jackie Semel project.
Oh, yes. So yeah, I think I've used the term carceral visuality. Sometimes I don't recognize the terms I'm using, but to describe the inundation that we are living with of images referring to incarceration, either directly or obliquely. So, how much of an effect is that inundation having on our lives? So Jesse was describing the visual language, and so much of our visual language has been colonized by the criminal legal system. Not only our language that seems to refer to the horrors of incarceration, but even our liberatory language, or even as we're trying to understand incarceration, we live with carcerality. What do I mean by this? I mean, Angela and I have talked about the critical resistance organizing moment when people were trying to think about what to put on a poster. And for abolitionists in the room, the first thing that everyone was thinking about is bars and handcuffs, right? So how do we think about a visual language that actually suggests there's something more going on than just bars and handcuffs, right? So what are the ways in which carcerality affects all of us, and yet we're not registering that it's affecting us? And then the second part of that is, as we're thinking about the problem of incarceration, even for people who are already focused on it, how do we disarticulate our visual exposures from the ways in which we're thinking about liberation? In other words, do we bring the things that we're learning by passively absorbing all kinds of cartoons and films and TV shows and news? How are we bringing those into our discussions about what's possible, what we can imagine in terms of the future? It's really felt to me that without addressing the popular cultural environment in which we're immersed in the ideology of the prison system, then we're really not going to be able to imagine a new reality, which is why I think artists and the arts have to be at the center of what we're trying to build and how we're trying to change. So, I mean, I could go on and on about this because I think that we don't have a visual culture, a moving visual culture history without incarceration being represented. One of Edison's earliest films, it's known by many in the film studies field, is a reenactment of an execution. So if we think about the entirety of our visual history for the moving image, we're really looking at our weddedness to the language of incarceration. And so, you know, how do we move out of this? And so you raised Jackie Summel, who's an amazing artist who has been doing a project called Solitary Gardens. And Jackie began this work with Herman Wallace, one of the Angola Three, who survived 40 years and more inside Angola prison in Louisiana, a horrific prison that many of us know because of its particular historical role in the post-slavery context. And his incarceration was an incredible example of how someone, even in the worst possible conditions, can be working for others, thinking collaboratively. And he ended up working with Jackie, who's a Louisiana-based artist, incredible artist who does what I guess we sometimes refer to as social practice art, which means that the art project that we see as viewers is really just a manifestation of all of the work that she's been doing and building relationships before we see that work. And the relationships persist after the work is exhibited. So Jackie's work has been working with incarcerated people to imagine, especially in the Solitary Gardens project, to imagine what kind of garden they would build. In Herman's case, it was also a house. What kind of house would Herman build? Down to every detail. So through a series of exchanges, through letters over years, these projects have been built. UC Santa Cruz, this project is working with Tim Young. Tim Young is incarcerated at San Quentin. He's been on death row since 2006. And Tim saw himself, even before he was incarcerated, as an artist. He wanted to become an artist and he dreamed of becoming an artist. And he's been concerned with issues of environmentalism and other issues that he has thought about through art for many years. And so Tim and Jackie have produced the Solitary Garden that exists now on the UC Santa Cruz campus. And it's a beautiful space right in the center of the arts complex where we can walk through and meditate and see Tim's letters and see what Tim wanted to have planted and how Tim imagines the world he would like to live in and the world he lives in his mind.
You shared, we have with permission one of his letters, a bit of one of his letters, very just I'll read. My goal and my role is to make them see me. And in return, perhaps the universe will bless me with the type of camaraderie that is not fleeting. I am reminded of something that Jackie Summel wrote in the house that Herman built, where she said, transform your trembling into action. Move closer to those from whom you have averted your eyes. gift your eyes, your voice, and your freedom of movement to those who need them most. And then to describe the garden itself, he says, the area that I labeled as the patio, he says, I think the garden should be about inner beauty. The area that I labeled as the patio or veranda, to me, that is the heart of the garden. The outer row was going to be about sugarcane and how it relates to slavery, mass incarceration, etc. The inner row, the crops, that's about sustenance. Anything of aesthetic beauty, I wanted that to be planted in the heart of the garden. As a prisoner, I have noticed that people tend to admire from afar. Rarely do they take the time to get to know you and or to discover your inner beauty. With the garden, I don't necessarily want people to be able to admire the roses, etc., from afar. If the sugarcane grows, it will act as somewhat of a barrier, and people will need to trek beyond the barriers in order to take in the garden's inner beauty. And so you can see that. And as I understand it, also the plots that Jackie works with are the dimensions, or I've seen some people say actually smaller than my cell, but meant to mirror the dimensions of a solitary cell.
Yeah. And I should also say about Tim that, one of the ways we're also working with Tim is that, we don't want to only support the art of Tim. We also want to support his struggle for freedom. And so we also have other scholars and artists who are working, especially Sharon Daniel, who's got a project called Making Exoneree. And I want people to know that, we, of course, want to exhibit the work of currently incarcerated artists, but we also want them free. And so it's really important to know that Tim is also actively working with us, and our film students are making work that's helping to help his innocence claim and helping his appellate court case. And I think this is something that is often not seen when we're talking about some of this work, that there is a lot in the background that's happening that is so very important. And hopefully the way we're learning to see through these gardens is a route to engaging others to know how we can all be a part of this transformation.
Time is not our friend right now. So what I'm going to do is put a few of these amazing questions, which many of you can see just scrolling through. I'm going to throw a couple out there, and whoever can take them and answer succinctly, and then we'll conclude with any kind of thought that each of you would like to leave us with. So I saw a couple of great questions about archives. And about what would be a practical way that someone could start doing community archives with incarcerated people. Another question about archives, it was broader. What is the role of archives in understanding mass incarceration? So that's one zone. I'm going to put a few out there. This question from Nina Tucker: what sort of personal liberation of the mind, spirit, politic needs to be prioritized in order to truly imagine freedom and liberate ourselves from that carceral conditioning? So that's another question. And then these are all so good. A very simple question, but one that I think is a very important one to answer. This is from Navina Clark. How does college education in and out of prison help incarcerated people? What does this mean for people once they come back home? So we have archives, we have spirit work, and we have college education, and anybody can jump in.
So, I mean, the one thing that it immediately made me think of, because, and I also didn't get to really touch on this earlier when we were speaking, is that, so much a part of my practice is also the Right of Return USA organization, right? It is literally trying to think through how to build systems of support and liberation for people who have been incarcerated, right? Specifically for formerly incarcerated artists. And so we've been doing that work for the past 5 years, right? And we've gotten, yearly we average almost 300 applications, right? And this is it's a very new kind of field. It's open application. And so, through this process, we've just been connected to this vast wealth of information through people applying to be right of return fellows. And it became very apparent to me a number of different things within that is that, we're dealing with a certain population of people mostly who have lost decades of their life, right? Who have lost opportunities of connecting with an artistic community, of getting a college education. There are so many things that are kind of wrapped up into what the carceral state does to people. And that became very apparent through this application process, which is in itself a kind of archive of all of these artists from across the country. And so kind of going through all of that information, part of what we're trying to design out now is what we're calling the Center for Art and Advocacy. And so we're very intentionally building out an academy incubator portion of this, which will have a curriculum that can be adopted by any museum or institution across the country to work with people within proximity in their own communities. And the other facet of this is a residency program to actually provide people with space and time to be free, to be creative. Because to me, it's imagination and creativity and kind of breaking out of these kind of punitive systems and how we think is actually having the time and space to be able to think. And it's very difficult out here in the world when you have to pay your bills. You just came home from prison. You have surveillance. You have all of these hooks in you. And we're trying to think very intentionally about how do we actually create a space for artists and advocates to actually be in community with each other. That is our space. And just the freedom and kind of liberty to think, right? To strategize and dream and imagine. And so I bring all of that up because I feel like they're all kind of very interconnected things. And so it's how do we actually think about creating the systems and structures in opposition to these punitive systems? And so it's really being intentional about building out space for creativity.
Thank you.
I'd like to address perhaps two questions, the question about education and the question about archives. It made me think about the work that Michelle Jones, who is currently a graduate student at NYU, but who was incarcerated for over 20 years at the Indiana Reformatory for Women. I can't remember the exact title of the institution. And she and some of her imprisoned colleagues began to do work on the archives of that prison. And what they discovered gave them the opportunity to write a journal article that completely disputed the conventional representation of what had historically happened in that prison. It was quite remarkable that they were able to argue that the violence that was putatively not present in women's prisons was massive and systematic. So this makes me think also about the struggle to bring education to people who are incarcerated. And, perhaps not so much to bring education, because I think incarcerated people who are not necessarily formally educated have brought a very different kind of education to those who are on the outside. And I have one example. My former co-defendant, Ruchelle McGee, many years ago in 1970, talked about prisoners as slaves. And introduced this notion of a connection between slavery and imprisonment that has since been researched and written about in so many ways. But the first time I encountered that analogy was from someone who had not received a formal education. So it helps us to recognize the nature of education and how education does not necessarily only happen in institutions, formalized institutions of education. And it also, I think, encourages us to do the work that needs to be done to guarantee that people who are in prison can be given the possibility of living the life of the intellect, which is the only way to experience freedom under those circumstances. And of course, it's the way we experience freedom, those of us who live in the so-called free world as well. But I would like to emphasize how much knowledge is incarcerated and how much intellect is incarcerated and how many dreams are incarcerated and how much vision is incarcerated. And this is, why we as abolitionists argue that those who are on the inside need to be allowed to participate in the process of reimagining our entire society.
Yeah. Could I add to that a little bit?
Please.
Answering some of the questions. So, Angela's pointing to something which I think we all need to reckon with, which is the irony of prison education, right? The people who've been denied access to education systematically throughout their young lives are the ones who are ending up inside. And yet, my experience of going inside is meeting up with people who have read things I don't even know how they found half the time. I remember being a very young professor going to a prison in Alabama, and someone came running up to me, which is already funny because the idea that someone can run up to you inside was weird, but it was only because the prison we were visiting had prisoners who were there from the time they were young, and really the guards were unafraid of what their behaviors would be. So there was a lot of interaction inside the prison. And, the people that I was talking to there felt like ideal students. And I thought, well, this is incredibly horrible that the way they've come to terms with the fact that they want this knowledge is by being denied access to the free world. So we definitely want to have these prison education programs, but they have to feed the other elements that I think were in those questions. Like, what are they doing spiritually? What are we doing? Are we thinking, as Angela's pointing out, that we're bringing the knowledge, or are we, making repair for what we haven't done? And, what are some more inventive ways to deliver prison prison education that are in an abolitionist framework? Like, why can't people travel to be in classes at universities or wherever, they are? It's happened in a few cases, but we think of that as completely untenable. But really, we should be using education programs to facilitate decarceration and to make it possible for people to have broader interactions in community in a safe way that can benefit everyone. What we don't want are programs that allow people to suppress other people's spiritual growth. And that sometimes happens with prison education programs. And so now I'm thrilled that people are really reconsidering this and thinking deeply about what it means and what it is, who's offering what, and who's taking what. And part of that is also thinking about these archives. So, I, as a scholar, I sometimes find archives funny because it's the stuff that's not there a lot of times that you want. And the stuff that is there is often strange. I think about my own, desk, what's here is what I'm not paying attention to half the time. So, what does it mean to think about archives? So, when we think about incarceration, we need to think about what are the forms of archives that actually can be built, and then also what will never be there, and how can we document this absence, which is why I think art is so important, because often it can call attention to that which we don't have access to in another way and remind us of the structures of what we're seeing.
I see something beautiful happening. There's someone named Rodney Spivey Jones who's very active in the chat. He just said, books, knowledge, new ideas circulate like heirlooms in prison. And he asks me a question. I'm a graduate of the Bard Prison Initiative and author of Black Disfigurement and the American Hieroglyphics of Race. Question, what role, impact does the scholarship of incarcerated people have on your work? And what I want to say to that, Rodney Spivey Jones, is that in the beautiful, beautiful movie about the Bard, a college at Bard, I did a panel conversation with your sister. And I said, I didn't even know she was your sister. And I was like, who's that genius over there talking about these things that I've been writing about for a long time, talking about race and spectacle and racialized violence and the, you know, the insistence of race and accompanying violence at the center of our national spectacle and trauma. You were talking about that. That's what I write about. She said, that's my brother. You were still inside. I understand you're out now, and I want to read your book that you've written and exchange work. But it's very beautiful to see you ask that question as we're having this conversation and thinking about the movement of ideas and knowledge and the things that we are trying so hard to make a contribution to make things better. So I see you, and I'm excited. We're just about at time, so why don't we go around and each of you please leave us with you know, anything. We haven't gotten to so much. We've gotten to so much. I see all that's happening in this beautiful chat, so I wish we could have gotten to all the questions. But closing thoughts from each of you, please.
One term that I want to leave us with is at risk. And I can remember going to an at-risk youth program. And I think that, you know, when we think about the prison industrial complex or mass incarceration, if we look back just a little further, what we have are at-risk youth. And so I hope that some of these same resources and pedagogies and interventions are happening at the level before we actually get to incarceration, because I think that's also part of it. And I would say in terms of the oral histories that, you know, obviously to look at the WPA project of enslaved people and to look at the history makers, because there are precedents, you know, maybe they're not the greatest ones or those are great, but I think, you know, anything that we endeavor, we should go back and look at what the exemplars are in that field. And so I hope whoever wants to do this oral history work is going to look at the exemplars and not just starting out blindly.
Thank you.
And I think, you know, one closing thought for me would be, like when we think about kind of building a movement, right, and thinking about kind of collective power, I think it's worth saying it's really important to not just focus on like individual figureheads, right, who are kind of like very charismatic. They come with kind of like preformed ideas. It's like a very easy thing to kind of support and get behind and amplify. But I think it's really important to think about cultivating new leaders and actually like building movement and building power, specifically when we're talking about people who have been incarcerated. And so I just think that's a very important part of how we're actually going to create new leaders, sustain the movement, bring more people into it, and also create more proximity, right? Because going back to thinking about like how I'm in Philadelphia and people are having these conversations, and I go back to Lancaster and they're not necessarily having these conversations, but they're equally impacted across the country, right? Lancaster is just reflective of every other kind of small city and rural community across the country. And it's like, how do we actually create and cultivate leaders all over the country that create proximity and allows that language, whether it's visual or written or whatever the creative kind of language is, that allows people to come into this movement and actually express and create empathy and create connection. Because I've experienced that a lot. Like I've talked in different communities, I've screened the films in different places. And, every time people come up to me and they always say, oh, such and such was incarcerated, my brother, my sister, my son, we just don't talk about it. And so, it's just like, it's so saturated at this point in this country, but it's like, how do we cultivate new leaders so that we are actually creating space for this conversation to happen everywhere?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, just to build on what Jesse just said, I mean, we're in a time where we're so cynical about leadership, right? Every time someone's in a leadership position, it becomes just time to attack. And I think Jesse's really gotten to something. It makes me think about how, we've transitioned in this moment to talking about leaderful movements, some feminist principles that are behind that. And I think those are really important to bring out. I'm just thrilled to be a part of a conversation that's indicative that for those of you who are struggling and feeling hopeless about what's going on, to know that over time, with hard work, attention can come to these issues and we can take advantage of this moment. And then we also know we have to survive another moment when there'll be those who are turned against us again. And I'm thinking right now of lifting up the Dream Defenders in Florida, another organization doing incredible work. And one of the things they're doing now in response to DeSantis is book banning and other things is distributing free books. And, they've consistently been focused on radical education and community education and building leaders. And I'm thrilled that all of these leaders are being built. And I hope it's not on a celebrity model. And I hope that we know that we're going to have to survive through many, many decades, hopefully in our lives, where we may be attacked for this work, but we know that there's a greater and more sustaining community around us to continue. And I'm thrilled to know that these energies from Mellon and from you, Elizabeth, and from others here on the call are going into this work. And I know there are going to be generations behind us and we'll need them.
Thank you.
This has been a wonderful conversation. And what I would like to emphasize is that as we imagine freedom, it's important not to assume that freedom is a destination, but that freedom is actually a process. It's actually the journey. And in that context, that I'm smiling now because I can remember when it really was not possible to have conversations like this, when even people who were most affected by the violence of prison systems were afraid to talk about prisons except as a place where all of the criminals are. And we've come so far since then. And that's an indication of how we can be successful in our journey for freedom and our journey that incorporates the impulse toward freedom, which will be an infinite journey. But again, thank all of you so much. I so appreciate your contributions, and thank you so much, Elizabeth, for creating this amazing opportunity.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been extraordinary. Thank you, everybody out there, for coming, for participating, for engaging. We do have another event scheduled soon that we hope you'll come back for. Why does affirmative action still matter? On Thursday, March 16th at 4 p.m. with Sherilyn Eiffel, Stuart Quo, and Melissa Murray. So we hope that you will join us for that. But to our guests today, thank you. And to all of you, may our hearts grow ever larger in compassion and connection. Thank you all so much.
All right, I'm rolling. Let's go. Are you ready, kid? I'm ready. You know, whenever I think about all the struggles and strife I've been through in my life, it's truly hard to comprehend. I mean, I'm sitting inside a cage on death row, yo. So far away from home, so far away from everything I know. Might as well be sitting inside the hold of a spaceship. That's what it feels like to be here. Yet it's hard sometimes to see how what I'm going through is connected to what my ancestors suffered and survived. Truth be told, I'm lucky to be alive, real talk. Sometimes when things get too heavy to carry, I close my eyes and drift back to a time when everything was all good. A time when it was fully understood that being here on this earth was the biggest blessing. My grandfather taught me that. See, I grew up in a neighborhood called The Village, a small enclave on the east side of Cleveland. A beautiful place, yo, with fruit trees and sweet things on every corner, no lie. I was surrounded by my family and friends then. I'm telling you, there was no end to the love we shared. A real community planned by people whose only plan was to live and give everything they had. They gave it all. Children of slaves who braved the worst of it, so we, the children and grandchildren, could make the most of it. Yeah. They'll shield us from the pain of knowing the truth. They never explained what kind of society we were born into. They didn't tell us about all the tricks and traps that were designed to re-enslave, or about the hate that could deliver us to an early grave. They wanted us to be free. They wanted us not to see all the ugliness around us. So a lot of us got caught up in the darkness and lost the light that was meant to guide us through. Gotta tell the children the truth. Tell them it's not what they say, but what they do. Tell them the real about reality. That life isn't meant to be fair, that it's meant to be lived. Tell the children the truth. Yeah. Tell them the truth.